Okay, it looks like we have as many people as we are going to have. So, welcome. This is Solving the Mysteries of Women in Your Family Tree, Tips for Researching Your Female Ancestors. My name's Sarah. I'm a librarian at the Haggard Library and a member of the genealogy team. And tonight we have Trey with us in the chat, who is also a librarian here at Haggard. He will be here to answer any questions or pass them along to me. So if you do have questions across the course of this presentation, please drop them into the chat and Trey will answer them if he can, or if he needs to pass them along to me so I can answer them for the group, he will do that as well. But let's get started. Let's talk about the women in your family tree. So when researching the women in your family, there are some challenges that are frequent for anybody doing research. For women, oftentimes their names would change when they got married. And if they had multiple marriages, that gives you even more names that you would have to search. And then different cultures have different traditions when it comes to naming conventions. So that could change how your ancestor, how their name changed or how they recorded the name changes. Women also historically had fewer legal rights than men and laws are regularly changing. So many different acts and laws that were passed in the 1800s, specifically here in the United States, began to give women more legal rights. So for some of your ancestors, it could be that their rights changed during their lifetime, and they might or might not be included in documentation, more legal documentation. Some women were silent partners and not really included in the land records or military records or paid taxes. They did leave that all to their husbands. And some just led private lives and really didn't engage in society or with the community. So, when faced with all of those challenges, how do we find anything out about our female ancestors? So, what we're going to talk about tonight in this class are the different types of records or documentation that include women, the sorts of information that can be found in these documents, and then where to find the different types of records. Women ancestors need to be researched differently than the male ancestors, and additional strategies are needed. You're going to have to get creative with where and how you search. So, hopefully, this class will get you to think outside of the box about your research strategies. So, how do we begin? So, in general, when you're researching anybody in your family, male or female, these are some good tips um, to help make your research easier or expand your research to find different records that you might not have thought about or would have known were out there. The first thing that we recommend is to create a timeline of your ancestor's life. Put all of the information you already have, plus any additional information you've gained during your research, into a timeline. That way, you can easily, at a glance, look at and see major milestones in your ancestor's life. To this timeline, you can also add um, historically what was going on at the time. If you include any major historical events that might have impacted your ancestor's life, that might give you more clues about the documents where you might find them. For example, if your ancestor was alive during the War of 1812 and was a able-bodied, um, man, let's see, at the time for the war purposes, then you might know you could probably find a female ancestor on the pension records. So think about those sort of things. As we discussed before, the laws affecting your female ancestors might have changed. You don't want to search for records that didn't or wouldn't exist for your ancestor at that point in time. And then the constantly changing laws might have given your ancestor more legal rights or less legal rights during her lifetime. So if you know when they were alive, you can kind of base your research around that. Sometimes it is better to focus on the family unit, not just the female that you are searching for. You're more likely to find records about a husband, a father, or a son that then will also include details about the woman than records about her specifically. So oftentimes you will have to think about your ancestor in relation to others in her life. She was a daughter. Was she a wife? Was she somebody's sister or a niece or a neighbor? When you can't find records about the woman, you have to turn to the others in her life to that could have left information about her and leave no record unturned. You don't know what piece of information is going to have that next clue that'll lead you on to even more things. Any questions so far? Saw the chat had some stuff in it.
No, no questions so far.
All right. Okay. So what type of records are there? Records are kind of broken up into two main categories. We have government records and social histories. Another way to think about this is sources created about women for government records and sources created by women for the social histories. Government records are going to be the more standardized traditional family history sources, such as vital records, census records, immigration naturalization, widows' pensions, court records, and insanity records. While you're going to have to be a little more creative when looking for possibly relevant social histories like letters and diaries, family Bibles, church records, societies, fundraising projects, or women's work. So these are the sort of records that we are going to explore today. It is not a comprehensive list, though. This is just to give you examples for ideas of the sort of places that you can look, but also be aware that just because these records exist does not mean that they will exist for your ancestor. These are just ideas of the sort of things that could possibly be out there. Okay, so first we're going to look at the government records. These are the sources created about women. Oftentimes, you will find them on online databases such as Ancestry or Family Search. The National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, has a lot of keeps a lot of records like this, and then courthouse records. So where to find the specific record will depend on the type that you're looking for, but those three are mostly going to cover where you would find government records. Some might only have an index, so you still might have to reach out to the record holder to get the full copy. Um, Other places to find specific records, we will talk about in their sections. So if you've done any family history research, you're going to be familiar with vital records. This meaning birth certificates, marriage records, and death certificates. Oftentimes, you're going to find the names of your ancestors, but also of their parents or children. For birth certificates and marriage records, you will often find things like your female ancestor's maiden name, the place and the date of their marriage. Sometimes they will include parents' names. If you look at our examples over here on the right-hand side, you can see these are marriage records from New Hampshire and Maine. I don't know if they have dates on them, but what they do have is information about the groom and the bride's father and mother. It's not just information about the bride and groom. So you wouldn't think that this sort of stuff would be on a marriage record, but these do have it. Let's see what else. Death certificates can also be a good place to find children's names. A children or a spouse is usually the informant giving all of the information for the death certificate and has to sign the document. So oftentimes you will find at least one child's name on that document. So like most of these records, you can find them on some online databases. Depending on which state it is, it um, records like these will often be kept at the state vital records office. Some will be county level, some will be city level or like town hall. You'll just have to check about how they do it in whatever state that you are researching. So here's some more examples of death records. These are from different time periods and places. So on the left, we have a New Hampshire death record example. It has, some good basic information, the place of the death, the date of the death, age. So even though it doesn't have birthday, you could calculate backwards and figure that out. Where they were born. At this point, they were widowed. So if you were looking for a husband, you would know that they died before this point. Of occupations, we have parent informations about the father and the mother and their birthplaces as well. So all of that is really good information that if you didn't have would be, a great clues to then continue your search. On the right, we have a more recent death certificate from Texas. So if you've done any research here, this might look familiar to you. This one is an interesting example, though, because if you look where it has the birthplace of father and mother's maiden name and birthplace of mother, it says NK, which means not known. Um, so the person that filled out this death certificate um, let's see, this was Clara Elizabeth Gill. It was her son Olaf who filled out the death certificate, and you would hope that he would have known something about his like grandmother because she had lived with him for 10 years, but he did not know. He did not know her maiden name. He did not know where she was born. So even though the lines are there for that information, it doesn't necessarily they're going to mean that they're going to be included on a death certificate. So the other type of records that you might be very, very familiar with if you've done any genealogy, family history research are the federal censuses. These, depending on the time period that you're searching, are going to have a lot of really good information about the women in your family. um, Maiden names, depending on when you find them in the census, their age, information about their birthplace or their parents' birthplace, date of marriage, and number, how many kids did they have? So if you are trying to research an ancestor from 1790, when the first census was recorded, to 1840, only the head of the household was listed. In a rare chance, sometimes this is a woman if she was widowed, but it is often unlikely that you're going to find information about women from census records during this time period. They are typically just tallied, so you could use that as a potentially corroborating evidence, but you would really need other things to prove who this woman was. But you could see that there was a woman in the household during this period. Since 1850, all family members have been enumerated, which means listed out individually. You can also use non-population schedules for clues. Um, for African American ancestors, they did slave schedules that will have more details listed out about those sort of ancestors. There's also farming schedules that oftentimes would include a list of like workers on each of the farms. So if you know that your ancestor was a farmer or owned land, you can try and look in some of those non-population schedules for clues as well. Um, Another couple of things to note. The 1890 census is going to be harder to find information from because most of those records were destroyed in a fire in 1921. Only 1% survived. And then from 1900 to 1940, those physical records were destroyed in the 1950s to make space. Some were poorly filmed and are completely illegible, especially the 1910 census. So we do have those records. They just might not be as clear as we would like them to be. And you can find all of these ancestry and family search. They are public record and they will all be included in there. You can also go to the NARA website and find all of those federal census and like non-population schedules there. Okay, so let's take a look. These are examples of censuses from the same town, but 80 years apart. So in the 1790 census on the left, you can see this is in that time period where only the head of household was listed out. So you can see the names of all the men over on the left, and then the columns that talk about free white males of 16 years old and upwards. So they would tally the number of people there. And then free white males under 16 is the second column. And then the third is just free white females. And then that number tallied there. So, for example, you can see that first line says Ephraim Wright. There were 4 women or 4 white females that were in his household in 1790. Um, but does that mean a wife and 3 kids? Is it a wife and 2 kids and maybe a mother-in-law? Is it a mother-in-law and his mother and the wife and 1 kid, or a sister that came to live? We don't know. And we have no way of knowing, unfortunately, unless you find other records about them. And then you can try and piece together if that is the same person that you're looking for. So on the right, the 1870 census, you can see that a lot more information has been recorded. So we have the head of the household, and then below them are all the people that lived in the household as well. And then what their profession or occupation or trade was for each person, male or female. Um, we have their age, their sex, male or female, and then color as well. So this first family group looks like Howard, say Neller. Uh, See, this is weird though. It says, oh, maybe it's Nellie Howard. So she is head of household, but she was 5. This doesn't seem right. Female. We have a 1-year-old male and a 62-year-old female. So I wonder if this one was cut across multiple pages. So, but you can see the different families. We can see a lot more female names on here as well. And same if you look in that male and female column. It's almost half and half. So we have a lot more information about the women of 1870 in this town than we do of the women of 1790. Oh yeah, you can see also column 10 is the place of birth. So that's a good indicator if you were looking, because this is in Massachusetts. So you can see some people were born in Connecticut. So I might have to go search there for records versus trying to stay here in Massachusetts if I was searching that person.
At this pause for a
Ooh,
sec, I just
yes.
want to inject something to anybody who may have tried to post a question in chat. Apparently, that defaults to no one gets to say anything, and I have fixed that. So if you have a question, I've answered one question in the Q&A. But now the chat and everything's fixed, so y'all can chat. Apologies for that.
I was like, I can give it just a pause for a second if anybody has any questions, we can throw them into the chat real quick.
Doesn't look like anybody is,
Oh,
but I'll keep an eye on it.
okay.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. So, another really common type of record that you will find are immigration and naturalization uh, papers. This is a whole bevy of different documentations from passenger lists, either like from the ship, the port of entry, or the port of departure sometimes. A declaration of intention that was required for immigrants from 1795 up until about 1952, an oath of allegiance, a petition for naturalization, and within that, sometimes would be naturalization depositions, so statements made by witnesses in support of an applicant's petition for citizenship. And then, if they were successful in their immigration process, they would get a certificate of citizenship. So I don't believe that all of these are things that you have to fill out currently, or there have been, again, the changing laws immigration information and law has changed many, many times. So, again, it's the best course of action to kind of figure out what time period your ancestor would have been coming over and what the laws regarding immigration were at that time period. So you would know if there was going to be a declaration of intent for you to look for, or an oath of allegiance, or if that was not something that was required at that time. So sometimes your like passenger lists or manifests are going to look very similar to a census record and contain a lot of the same sort of information, including maiden names, birthplace, birth date, date of marriage. If they were traveling with their children, their children's names and birthplaces and birth dates. This will also tell you the date and the ship of arrival. So like if we know that this one was 1939, I believe was the date that the ship came over. Um, your ancestor might be in the 1940 census, but if you try and search on the 1920 census, they're not going to be there. It'll also tell you the port of embarkment and or the port of entry. Um, your ancestor might not have stayed there, but they might have. So it might be a good place, or maybe they stayed there temporarily once they came over and then moved someplace else. So it gives you an idea of where to start that you could look for um, more records about your ancestor. And this one is a really nice passenger list. It is all typed out. If you find older ones from like the early 1900s, those are all handwritten, and you do have to flex those handwriting reading skills that if you've ever read old handwriting, know it's kind of difficult, but lots of good information can be found there as well. So same thing, you can find a lot of this on Family Search or Ancestry, those sort of databases. Sometimes courthouse records will have some of the petitions or oaths. Same with the National Archives and Records Administration. You can also look at the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services website. They have a whole page for genealogy, and you can look through their records there. So some search tips when you're looking in these different places. Like I was saying, there are constantly changing laws regarding immigration and naturalization, even to this day. So look at the specific time period that your ancestors were alive. Prior to 1855, there are no specific references in naturalization laws regarding women's citizenship. But from about 1855 to 1922, a woman would get automatic citizenship when she married a US or naturalized citizen. And then even within that period, there were some changes as well. So from 1907 until 1922, if a divorce happened, the woman would retain her citizenship if she remained in the US or registered within 1 year of leaving the country. Or if she was married to a foreigner, the woman lost her US citizenship and took the nationality of her husband. But after 1922, there was no automatic citizenship, and you did still retain your US citizenship if marrying a foreigner. So, all of these different laws you got to keep in mind when you're trying to search for your ancestor.
We do have a
Uh,
quick question.
sure.
Um, so weren't people considered cargo on earlier records and therefore not named?
Um, for manifests and stuff like that, typically not. They even though they were like put in steerage or like in the lower classes, they would still be, they had a list of people that they would take over. I would say for like older, like if you have African American ancestors, for like the census records, yes, they are considered property, depending on what year. So they might not be listed out. But for ship records, I haven't seen any examples where they were just listed or where people were just listed as cargo. I believe everybody's been is still enumerated. Again, depending on where they came from, what time period, all of that. But that's a good question. Any other ones, or was that the only?
I was the only one at the moment.
Okay. So, oh, there were different
Follow.
laws. Ooh, follow up.
Yep. Yeah, that was follow up. The response was the attendee thought they had heard that it was for the 1700s.
Maybe. Um, I haven't found any ship records like back then. Um, That's an interesting, if you have the specific question, you can always email us at genealogy@plano.gov. That'll send it to the genealogy librarians, and we can look into that a little more if you'd like. But yeah, off the top of my head, I haven't heard that, but I've also not searched records that far back for like immigration or naturalization type stuff. Okay. Okay, so different laws for widows. Like we were talking about with the census records, that sometimes widows would be enumerated if they were the head of household. Um, there were different laws regarding immigration and naturalization as well. So from 1804 to 1806, a widow would still become a citizen if her husband had filed a declaration of intent, but had died before he had completed the naturalization process. So there were a lot of times too that if like a a man was applying for naturalization, that it automatically carried over to his wife as well. Like if he became a citizen, then she would. Were some of the changing laws. So I think that's what this happens as well. Just if your husband was already in the process of naturalizing before he passed, you would still get the benefit and become a citizen as well without having to start the whole process over. So there's a lot of fun things that you can find in these records and maybe stuff that you wouldn't even expect that you would find. So this is an example of the petition for naturalization. It includes affidavits from the petitioner and witnesses, and on the back had the oath of allegiance. Um, so you can see that they uh, declare on oath that they have renounced King George V of Great Britain and Ireland. So that's a little fun piece of thing. So that's a detail. We know that they've come from the UK. Um, Over here, it does say from Ludlow, England. But the interesting piece of information from this was it actually had when and where this couple was married um, in Spokane, Washington in 1917. So if that's not a piece of information that you had before, you now have the date and the location. And with other things on this, you have, the husband and the wife's names. It's a lot of information for a single document that, you're just like, oh, it's just them coming to the US. Now, there's a lot of information that you could find here. Let's talk some more about widows. They get a lot of fun exceptions to the rule when it comes to different laws. Um, widows' pensions were first started federally in 1780. And then that was for specifically widows of Revolutionary War veterans. So many additional acts passed in the 1800s. Again, you'll have to do some research to find the applicable laws for the years you want to search. Um, but they did pension records, I believe, all the way through World War I for widows. So again, you can find their maiden names often, the date and the place of marriage, names and ages of children, and sometimes they will have copies of family documents, such as a marriage certificate, a family Bible page that documents their marriage, or affidavits of family members attesting to the marriage. So they had to prove their relationship to this veteran to get the pension benefits. So if you're lucky, sometimes you will get those things. NARA is going to be the best place to try and find these records. Their website provides information on how to access the pension records and how to order federal military pension applications. Some records have been digitized and you can find them online. And if you know your family has been here in Texas for generations, the Texas State Library and Archives Commission does have some pension records specifically for the Confederate Army in Texas. Okay, so this on the
And
right is an example of, oh, yeah,
yeah, I was just going to inject also the Texas General Land Office also
yes.
has a surprising amount of documents for Texas Republic pension information as well.
Yeah, it's the fun thing about doing genealogy research is I would not think like the land office would have that sort of stuff, but they do. And you get to go to all these different fun government offices and find what sort of fun, neat records they have. That's why y'all like genealogy, right? It's a fun puzzle that you get to unravel.
Yeah, because they've got an amazing set of interesting genealogical gems that people have sent in
Hmm.
to prove the receiving their pensions. So it could be family diaries, letters from their spouse during the wartime to prove that they fought for the
Hmm.
Republic. So some very interesting stuff. They have an eclectic collection of those kind of documents as well.
Yeah, it's all sorts of fun things that you wouldn't think about or wouldn't realize were there. Oh, okay. So on the right here, we have an example of this is I believe, a Revolutionary War pension list. Um, you can see on the left, we have the names of the widows, and then the second column is the widow of, and it'll have the husband's name. And then we have their rank, how much they get in pension, and then I believe this is like marked off every uh time they get their money. I'm actually not sure what the right-hand columns are. Do you know, Trey?
I
Is
can't
it?
read it. I'm not sure.
It says September, March. I believe it's a biannual. They would get their pensions twice a year. And then so they've marked off who's gotten them, when they gotten it. There's different notes if like they moved or they died, and so they won't be receiving pensions any longer. That's on this list. Sometimes it is easier to search the veteran's name and not the woman's name, even though the women's name are included on this. Sometimes it's easier to bring up um, through the male ancestor. And as I was saying, the pension applications were from the American Revolution to just before World War One. This is another example of a pension record. Um, the researcher had only known their ancestor as Elizabeth Broom, but thanks to this record, they found out that her maiden name was actually Reed, and she had married Henry Broom, who then died, and then she remarried Jeremiah Moore. So it gave them a lot. This was the proof of her marriage from the minister in the pension on the right-hand side. Uh, and so, yeah, proved when they were married, where they were married, her maiden name, and that was not information that the researcher had before. But there you go, finding it in the pension records. Okay, we do have court records as well. Again, if you've done a lot of genealogy research, you're going to be familiar with a lot of these types of records. There are wills or probates, where women were often listed as heirs for their fathers or husbands, deeds or land records. Typically, women weren't the ones owning land, but oftentimes you will find what is called a dower release, which was a legal provision for a woman's support and that of her children after her husband's death. So sometimes it could be that they will sell the land, but the woman has to have, $100 a year after her husband's death. Just interesting little things to at least provide for a woman and her children. Divorce petitions are a really interesting record. Up until the mid 1800s, divorce was a legislative action and then turned judicial. So, and sometimes, like, women could even petition for divorce, even if the divorce wasn't granted. So, even if you have an ancestor who, is married, you don't see any divorces or things like that in the history or the record, that doesn't mean that they didn't petition for it. Women could petition courts on the grounds of desertion, cruelty, adultery, homosexuality, or bigamy were the most common um, grounds that they could use. And then family, neighbors, or friends could be called in to testify in these cases as well. So maybe it wasn't your female ancestor who was petitioning for the divorce, but their next door neighbor was, and now they've gotten an affidavit from your ancestor, and now that's included in these divorce petitions. You never know. Always good to look everywhere you can. Leave no stone unturned. There's also orphans or guardianship court. Um, Oftentimes, historically, a widow's minor children were seen as orphans in the eyes of the court and required a legal guardian, which was almost always male, to handle their affairs. Otherwise, fathers of motherless children would sometimes take up a guardianship if the father was not in the picture as well, and to gain inheritance from the mother's family or to be like have a ward and you would get like a stipend for taking on the guardianship of this orphaned child. So in these records, you will often find maiden names, or sometimes you have to be with wills and things like that. Sometimes the records will only say my wife or et ux, ETUX, which is Latin for my wife. Um, so you would have to use your context clues of like who the spouse is, who the children are, to confirm that that is your female ancestor. Sometimes it will only list the person with their married name, but that still does place your ancestor at a specific place and time. So it's good. proof and verification of when and where they were. Sometimes it will include marriage places and dates, or the names and ages of children. So as you can see from our example here below, for Charles Swan, this is an abstract of his will and probate. It was a great find for the researcher because it had their children all listed out with their married names. So they were able to do more research and find more information from here. So where do you find these records? So in Texas, Texas had pretty liberal divorce laws in the mid 1800s, and you will likely find those at county courthouses. If you want to learn more about how to do courthouse research and all of that, we do offer a class with more in-depth information. And we have a recording, I believe, on our YouTube page. So if you want to learn about courthouse records, that's a good place to start.
We have another question here.
Sure.
Question is, where can divorce petitions be found?
Yeah, so courthouses likely sometimes they will go through the state legislature. Most states handled divorce through the state legislature until it became a judicial issue. Again, depending on the time period, you might start with the state, but then I would look specifically in the county courthouses. Another tip or trick for trying to find maybe where a divorce petition might be would be to look in the newspapers of the area that your ancestor lived. Sometimes there might be articles or public notices about the divorce if the actual records cannot be found. Any other questions about this?
Think we're good for now.
No. Okay. So the last type of government record that we're going to talk about is insanity records. Oftentimes, women were committed to like mental institutes for ailments that are today considered commonplace, such as postpartum depression, menopause, bipolar disorder, regular depression, schizophrenia, other mental illnesses like that, anxiety. Um, Records may be harder to find, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Um, you're going to be more likely to find clues in other public records or other sort of things. But if you're having trouble, this is just a good out of the box sort of way that you can research. Current privacy laws for medical records do make searching a little harder as well. So yeah, just be aware of that when you're doing research. Um, but often, most records fall under private jurisdiction from these sort of establishments. So they could be or could have been destroyed at any time or withheld from the public. But if this is an avenue that you want to go down and research, you can check the census records from 1840 to 1880. Federal censuses from this period have a column denoting insane person. So if you are looking through the census records and happen to see your ancestor with a, check mark denoting that they are an insane person, you might want to try and find to see if they have, if there are medical records about their commitment. The 1880 census also included a defective, dependent, and delinquent classes non-population schedule. Um, so those that would have been marked as insane person, there would be a whole non-population schedule enumerating some of their statistics and facts. You can also try and search for probate and surrogates records. Um, Court records such as these may give details to a woman being declared incompetent or being institutionalized. If they had children and they were being institutionalized, you could possibly also look at like orphan court records, or like these might be in the surrogates records about what happened to their children if they were institutionalized. Just extra details that you might not have had. Um, if you do find that your ancestor had been institutionalized or what the institution was, you can always contact the local historical society in that area or library to see if there are any records that still exist. They might be the best people that know. Okay, so those are all these sources about women. So let's get into now the social histories, the sources created by women. These are going to augment and supplement what you find in the historical or the government documents or fill gaps when there are no records of your female ancestor. And again, just because these sources might exist does not mean that they do exist. This is just giving you an idea of places to look and the sort of detective work you would need to find this sort of information. Lots of times, you're going to find these sort of documents or records in university special collections. For example, Texas Women's University has an amazing special collections department that has a lot of women-focused collections. Same Duke University has some really good, like I believe they have letters and journals from Civil War women. Um, there's also a bibliography called American Women's Letters and Diaries that you can find, and it'll show places that have specifically like women's collections. Uh, Other archives. Here at the Plano Public Library, we do have a small Collin County focused archive that has some journals and letters and things like that from our four founders. Um, so you can always check with the like local libraries. Some could be at universities or historical societies. The Library of Congress has an American Women Guide that shows you how to explore Library of Congress collections for women-specific information. Again, with the Collin County archives that we have here at Plano Public Library, we have the Collin County Images database. So some of the items from the archives have been digitized and can be found online. Uh, Oftentimes, though, you will find these things as like family heirlooms. Okay, so let's talk about some of the specific ones. First off, we have letters, diaries, and journals. These are going to give you a rich detail of your ancestors' life. It's going to be more than just the government records that are just facts, facts, facts. If you're lucky enough to find a letter or a diary or a journal that your ancestor wrote, it might have details like slept in this morning, went to church, ate a turkey for dinner, went camping, that sort of information. You can get a fuller picture of what their life was like. You can also search in the writings of other people in the community for mentions of your ancestor if you don't have any writings from your family. So, for example, if you knew your ancestor grew up in Plano in the late 1800s, we have the Lizzie Carpenter diaries or journals that have been digitized and put online. You can see the example of one here on the right. And maybe your ancestor was mentioned in that journal. So worth reading, and it's always fun to read and see what was happening in, 1876. Like that, people of that day and age still doodled in the headers and the margins, made their fonts all fancy. It's fun. It gives it more personality. A lot of the times, though, these are going to be unlikely resources to be found online. So, oop, scrolled the wrong way. So yeah, just be aware, many are not digitized or indexed, and you're going to have to reach out to the different institutions to see what sort of holdings they have. Family Bibles and church records are often really interesting ways of finding birth, marriage, or death information. Birth records could also include in the Bible like baptism or christening records. Uh, or yeah, for church records, maybe there's a newsletter that has marriage announcements or registers. You'll often find your names, maiden names, and dates and places of these life events. Some things to think about with these records as well. Sometimes the family Bible is the only record of a birth or a marriage. So, if, for example, a child died shortly after birth, a birth or death record might not have been filed depending on the time period. This is especially true in the time periods prior to the state keeping vital records. Sometimes the family Bible was it, that was the record of the birth. You can always check if you are not the one that happens to have the ancestral family Bible. You can check with your distant family members or local history groups to see if maybe one of them has it, or if they donated it, such an item, to a local history group, a library, a university. Or if the church is still in existence, it's always worth reaching out to them to see if they might still have the records. This is one of my favorite different ways to look for your female ancestor. Um, Oftentimes, women had pretty active social lives. So kind of consider again what time period were they were they alive, and what sort of clubs or organizations would have been popular at that time that they might have joined. So we have like political organizations like the League of Women Voters, religious like church groups, social causes like the Junior League, or one that was very popular in Plano in the late 1800s, early 1900s was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Um, Heritage groups such as Daughters of the American Revolution, academic or educational groups, or were they in a sorority? Were they in like honors societies? Same for different ethnic groups or different occupational or professional groups. For librarians, we have the American Library Association or the Texas Library Association as professional organizations that we can join. Did those sort of things exist? Was there a teachers union that your ancestor might have been a part of? So a lot of these don't go very far back into time. They're mostly from the late 1800s onward, but there are a bevy of them. So it's worth looking into. And then if you know what sort of organizations or activities the male in the family participated in, then it's worth it search and see if there is a female auxiliary group. So yes, you know that one of your male ancestors was part of the Sons of the American Revolution, and maybe his wife was part of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Good little things to think about. Within these records, sometimes you'll find membership records, just a list of all the people that were in the group. Occasionally, there will be scrapbooks or other ephemera from these groups, newspaper articles, maybe about this society through a potluck or through a raffle, and it was head up by the treasurer, your ancestor. Um, you can find that sort of information or any other group documents. Like you always said, like newsletters, things like that. So oftentimes it's just going to be names that you find, but again, it gives you a place and a time that your ancestor lived in a specific area, and it gives details about their life. Yeah, if they were the president of the junior league, then they were probably pretty active socially and all of these different things that they would have done. It gives you just more details like that to round out these women's lives. One fun thing that the clubs and organizations and societies would do was fundraising projects as well, for a group, for their group specifically, or maybe for a specific cause. And oftentimes that's when you will find fantastic information about these women in your family tree. The most common types of projects they would do are cookbooks and quilts. Quilts were often called signature quilts because the pattern was just blocks with the women's names in it. So you can see all of the different signatures on the right there as an example of one of the signature quilts. Cookbooks I really love too. 'Cause normally it'll just have like a name and the location, but you can see what sort of things your ancestors ate. And food is a really, common essential thing that all of us share. So this is one of the tamer recipes that I have found, but I did have to include a Jello recipe. That one seems relatively normal. So oftentimes you'll find, again, names, just places lived in these records. But for cookbooks, you might also find things like advertisements for local businesses that could include names that maybe didn't submit a recipe. But now you found the Schimmelfinnig grocery store, and you have a Schimmelfinnig ancestor. Maybe I'm looking in this town and seeing if I can find more information about them. Um, And then, yeah, and then signature quilts, you actually get to see your ancestor's signature. And that's a very personal thing. Like they wrote that, they sewed that with their hands. So if you're lucky enough to find that, it is a very, very cool piece of thing to find about your ancestor. Okay, lastly, for social histories, you can also look into jobs that were considered women's work. A lot of domestic work, industry type things, domestic industry, that was considered women's work. So if there are records about that, sometimes you can find names, you can get meeting notes, membership lists, or company histories if they were, been with this company 30 years and they had a retirement, maybe that was made a big deal about and is in the company newsletter and you can find that. Or they had um like a union group that you could go and find, even if they were just the secretary and they're the one taking the minutes. Um, that might be information that you could find. So just consider what sort of businesses were in the area. You can always search through newspapers for ads for local businesses. If you know there was just one school in the area and your um, ancestor was a teacher, you might be able to narrow down and see if you could find any records from that. Okay, any questions before we move into our final other considerations?
None currently.
Okay, so this is just going to be some quick last things to consider when doing your research. As I talked about a little earlier, things for African American ancestors are going to be a little different, especially pre-Civil War. 1850 and 1860 in the federal census, they did do the slave schedules, which were mostly used in the southern states. Um, these provide supporting evidence for a hypothesis derived from other resources. So oftentimes when you are researching enslaved persons, the slave schedules are helpful when used in conjunction with the 1870 federal census or any of the census mortality schedules from 1850 to 1885, or wills or other probate documents, because sometimes they will enumerate the slaves out, the enslaved persons out. Um, Oftentimes they won't. It will just be like the earlier federal censuses where it's just a tally number of people. But that's when you use this as supporting evidence for all of the other pieces of information that you've found. Um, yeah, oftentimes descriptions of the enslaved person will be found in the records. Most will omit personal names. It would just be the name of the enslaver. Um, but sometimes, people would fill things out incorrectly and would put the name of the enslaved person. Post-Civil War, it's really, you need to search the Freedmen's Bureau. This was active between 1865 and 1872 and was established to undertake the relief effort and social reconstruction that would bring freed people to full citizenship. So they issued food and clothing. They would help locate family members, legalize marriages that had taken place on these plantations, before they had gained all of their rights. It is the richest and most extensive record source in the post-Civil War and Reconstruction eras. They do have state records of like assistant commissioners and superintendents of education. There are records from field offices around the South, and there's marriage records specifically too. And you can find all of these on the NARA website. So highly recommend if you have African American ancestors searching there because that is the bulk of information in the Reconstruction era. As we talked about briefly in the beginning, different cultures use different names or have different naming conventions. So this is kind of a brief overview of how some vary from one another. So the French and Italians for female ancestors will still use their maiden names in legal documents, where German or Polish Catholic, there we go, would use their maiden name, but only in their death records. The Dutch women, early colonials, would keep their names in their marriage records. Scottish widows would go back to their maiden names after the death of their husbands. Some Welsh peoples would retain their maiden names even after they were married. Scandinavian and Hispanic women like to keep their maiden name and use it almost as like a middle name and then use the spouse's surname. So, or we'll have two surnames. And then the Quakers will use that maiden name as a middle name as well. And then oftentimes, if you have a Jewish family, those family names ending with S or ES are derived from the mother or the wife versus the husband. So again, all these are all different clues or different ways that you might have to search. Like if you know I come from a Dutch background, then I'm probably still going to want to search my ancestor's maiden name if I have that. Things to keep in mind. Okay, and last but not least, here's some just other places that you can consider. Indentured servitude or bondage records. If your ancestor was a refugee, what sort of records might they have? Domestic records, sponsorship records. Did they sponsor somebody that was coming over? Did somebody sponsor them? Passport applications. I mean, newspaper, cemetery records, Facebook. Sometimes you can go find historical societies for different towns on Facebook and they'll start posting, look at all these cool things we have, and you don't know. Maybe someday somebody will pop up and post something about one of your ancestors.
We
Just,
had a
oh, yes,
Sorry. Yeah, we had a comment about that very thing. Society columns were a popular thing in almost a bygone era of, Mrs. So and so went and visited her sister in, out of state because
exactly.
that was a big trip, right? So, she made a trip of multi states away, or she visited either a friend or a relative, and a lot of times they were mentioned, so you kind of have those connections through. Yeah, that's kind of a dying thing, but those are very prevalent in a lot of the early newspapers.
Yeah, I know I've looked in old things in like the Plano Star Courier, and it is truly like, oh, this person went. Yeah, not even out of the state because Texas is so giant, but like, oh yeah, they went to Houston and visited an ancestor or a relative. And that made the newspaper because that was big old news back in the day. So just like I said in the beginning, just be creative, be open with where you look and where you might find information. So these are just some examples of places that you wouldn't necessarily think to look, but then have that sort of pieces of information. This first one on the left is a history about Dooley Elementary here in Plano and mentions when he was married was 1918. I would not think if I was looking the history of Dooley in Elementary, it would have that information, but it does. Same thing. The book Cemeteries of Collin County mentions several marriages throughout it, especially because the families are often buried all in the same place together. So it has some details about their marriage. Um, these are just some other sources by women um, that are in our collection and can mention surnames. So for example, um, yeah, records of indentured servants and of certificates for land in the 16, 1700s in Virginia, but it has first names, last names, ages, years. It has a lot of good dates and information about women specifically, which you might not have thought would be in something like that. And then on the right is a Facebook post. All sorts of this was a wedding ensemble from the late 1800s. So that has names, dates, locations of marriages, children's names, um, great niece, current people as well. So, you know, don't think you would find all this information on Facebook, but there you do. All right. That is all I have for y'all this evening. Are there any final questions before we wrap up tonight?
We did have a really good question. Any
Mhm.
ideas for a relative that we suspect was born illegitimate? I can't find his certificate and have no info on his mother. That's certainly a brick wall that I have no experience, hadn't had to research. So I'm at loss for ideas. So I had suggested email the genealogy team at the genealogy at plano.gov. But Sarah, do you have any ideas?
My first gut instinct would be trying to look through census records, just depending on how old they are. So I believe we have up to 1950 has been um, made public. So depending on how old they are, they still might be in those sort of census records. Even if they aren't, if you know their any information about them, where they were born, when they were born, any information about like mother or father, you can try and look in those areas and see if you find. But yeah, otherwise, I would say email us and we might be able to set up some time that we could sit and help figure that out or where else to look. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for attending our program tonight. You can always find more resources on our website at planolibrary.org or on our blog, planolibrarylearns.org. And we do have a podcast that has a lot of great information about the library as well. It's called Plano Library Speaks, and you can get it, I believe, wherever you get your podcasts. It's also through that link. And we look forward to seeing you in our next genealogy class, which I'm not sure what it is. Trey, do you have any idea?
Oh, you put me on the spot.
Haha.
I forgot to look that up ahead of time. I am
Well,
so
it'll be
sorry.
next month. It'll be at same time, same place. It'll be a Tuesday night at 7 p.m.
Yes,
So
when's
if you
this?
have not registered for it already, it'll be on the website through our calendar. We
Yes,
hope to see you there.
the soonest one we have of course, the genealogy DNA forum. That's
Yes.
on Haggard on Tuesdays. That's in person and virtual at 7 o'clock. And that one will have one on September 10th. And then there's Scouting Military Records on September 24th. And then we have great folks doing a presentation or doing kind of answering questions on how to join the DAR. That's on Saturday, September 28th at 10:30 a.m.
Well, we got a lot of good stuff
So we
coming
got a
up.
lot of stuff in September coming up.
And then preview in October, we will be having the annual genealogy lock-in, which is a full day of genealogy presentations hosted by the Waco Public Library. So information about that should be on our website shortly. Please register and we'd love to see you there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, thanks for joining us and we will see you
Thanks.
next time.
Y'all have a good evening.